Welcome back to Frightening Shadows, where darkness isn't just a place, it's a story waiting to be told. Tonight, we journey into the unknown, where time itself becomes a source of terror, the vanishing hour. As always, this story is intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Detective David Cole has been chasing shadows all his life, but nothing could have prepared him for what he's about to uncover. A case that begins with a tragic event soon reveals something far more disturbing. As the clock strikes a cursed hour, reality twists, and the answers he seeks may come at a terrifying price. Step into the darkness and discover what happens when time isn't just against you, it's hunting you. If you're enjoying the stories here on Frightening Shadows, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what lurks in the shadows. David Cole sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the flickering glow of his laptop the only light in the room. He was 42, a veteran in homicide investigations, with over 20 years on the job. He'd seen it all: the blood-soaked bodies, the empty stares of the dead, the grief-stricken families. The horrors of the job had hardened him, dulled the sharp edges of fear that would cripple others. But there was something about this case that crawled under his skin, an itch he couldn't scratch. It refused to let him go. Sarah and Ben, both young, late 20s, deeply in love. At least, that's what everyone said. Neighbors, friends, family, they all swore the couple was happy. No domestic disputes, no hidden skeletons, no brewing tension. And yet, something at the crime scene had told a different story. One of madness, violence, and death. Ben had supposedly lost control, shooting Sarah in the kitchen before turning the gun on himself. The department labeled it an open and shut case, a domestic gone wrong. But David knew better. He felt it the moment he stepped inside their house. The first time he crossed that threshold, the air hit him. A dense, rotting smell that seeped into his lungs, sticking to the back of his throat. The house wasn't a crumbling ruin. It was just a house. Ordinary, well-kept. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry. But there was something wrong about the place. Something that made his skin crawl the moment he saw the bodies. Sarah lay twisted on the kitchen floor, one arm outstretched as if she'd tried to crawl away. Her face was contorted, frozen in an expression of pure, visceral terror. Eyes wide, mouth half open, like her final breath had been a scream. Ben was slumped against the counter, the gun still loosely gripped in his hand. A neat hole in his temple, a spray of blood behind him marking the wall like some grotesque piece of art. His expression was different, empty, hollow, like there was nothing left of him even before he pulled the trigger. David knelt beside Sarah's body, the smell of copper thick in the air. He could still feel the chill radiating from her skin, the blood pooling beneath her sticky and black. It was too still, too quiet, even for death. Something had happened here, something far worse than a simple murder-suicide. Then there was the clock. It hung above the stove, the red numbers flickering in and out, but they were frozen at 2:47 a.m. He glanced at his watch. It wasn't even close to that time. The others dismissed it as a power surge, a glitch. David wasn't so sure. The next morning, he'd been told to file it away, move on. but the smell clung to him. The image of Sarah's wide eyes burned into his memory. Something was missing, something they hadn't seen. And then he found the footage. It was late, the kind of late that bled into early morning. The streets outside were silent, the city itself asleep. David sat hunched over his desk, the soft hum of his laptop filling the room. He'd gone back to the evidence box, looking for something, anything that might explain what had happened in that house. And that's when he found it, an SD card, buried under stacks of paperwork, overlooked like it didn't matter. But it mattered. The footage was grainy night vision, casting the entire room in ghostly greens and grays. It showed 2 weeks' worth of security camera recordings from inside Sarah and Ben's bedroom. For the first few nights, it was nothing. Just the couple sleeping, the quiet rise and fall of their chests. But on the 5th night, something changed. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the footage cut out. David frowned, leaning closer to the screen. The blackout lasted 13 minutes. No static, no sign of tampering, just gone. When the recording resumed, Sarah was sitting upright in bed, her eyes open, staring straight ahead. Her body was stiff, her mouth slightly open, like she'd been jolted awake by something unseen. David played it back, again and again. There was no sound, no movement, no explanation. Just that cut. The next night, the same thing happened. At 2:47 a.m., the footage cut out for 13 minutes. And when it resumed, Ben was out of bed, standing at the window, staring into the darkness outside. His posture was rigid, tense, as if he'd been waiting for something to emerge from the woods beyond the house. Something neither of them could explain. David's pulse quickened. Why were they recording themselves? What had they known? Night after night, the footage continued, each time at 2:47 a.m., each time cutting out for 13 minutes. And when it resumed, Sarah and Ben were different. Detached, disoriented. Sarah would walk aimlessly into the hallway, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. Ben would stand by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared out into the void. By the end of the 2 weeks, they were barely recognizable. Sarah had become gaunt, her skin pale, her eyes sunken. Ben's face had grown slack and drained of color, as if the life had been sucked out of him. The camera caught them standing in the middle of the room on the final night. Sarah with her back to Ben and Ben at the door, his hand on the knob. Neither of them moved. Then, at 2:47 a.m., the footage cut out for the final time. They were found dead the next day. David replayed the footage until his eyes burned, his mind racing with questions. Every night at the same time, the blackout. What had happened during those 13 minutes? What had Sarah and Ben seen? And more importantly, what had seen them? David's obsession grew. He couldn't let it go. Every night he sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the screen, the footage looping over and over in the background. He needed answers, but none of it made sense. The way they moved, the way they changed, it was like something had been happening to them, something they couldn't stop. The The breakthrough came when David started digging through their online search history. Missing time during sleep, unexplained night terrors, and then a phrase that sent a chill down his spine: the vanishing hour. David had never heard of it, but the search led him down a dark rabbit hole of local legends and folklore. Stories of people waking up at exactly 2:47 a.m., confused, dazed, sometimes violent. Old newspaper clippings about people going missing. Clocks stopped at that exact time. Violent outbursts that ended in bloodshed. It wasn't just Sarah and Ben. There were others, and they all traced back to the same myth, the vanishing hour. It was tied to the Bell Witch, an old legend from Tennessee, but the curse had spread beyond that. It was said that during the vanishing hour, the living lost control, becoming puppets to unseen forces, their memories erased, their bodies left marked by something beyond the physical. David's heart raced as he read. Sarah and Ben hadn't been alone. They'd been caught in something far older, far darker than he'd imagined. And now, as he watched the footage, the 13-minute gap felt like a doorway, a window into something that shouldn't exist. But David wasn't ready to believe it. He couldn't. His rational mind fought back, demanding an explanation that made sense. Ghosts weren't real. Curses didn't exist. But the more he tried to explain it away, the more the dread gnawed at him. The exactness of it, the 13 minutes, the time, the blackouts. It was too specific, too deliberate to be random. The worst part? He was starting to feel it too. The blackouts started soon after David began obsessing over the footage. At first, they were brief, just moments when he'd lose track of time, find himself staring at his laptop without remembering how long he'd been sitting there. But then they got worse. Every night, like clockwork, he'd wake up at 2:47 a.m., his heart pounding in his chest, sweat slicking his skin. Sometimes he found himself standing by the window, staring into the street below, just like Ben. Other times he'd wake with scratches along his arms, thin red lines that burned but didn't bleed. He tried to explain it away, but he couldn't. And then the dreams began. They weren't just nightmares. They were vivid, real. He was back in Sarah and Ben's house, standing in their bedroom, watching the clock flicker from 2:46 to 2:47. He'd hear footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. But he always woke before they reached him. The nights bled into each other. The blackouts became more frequent. He'd wake in different parts of his apartment, disoriented, his body aching. His phone's call log showed missing calls to numbers he didn't recognize, voicemails filled with silence. Then, just before the message ended, a soft, rasping breath over the receiver. And that's when David knew whatever'd taken Sarah and Ben had found him. David's apartment was beginning to feel more like a prison. The nights dragged into one another, his mind circling the same obsessive thoughts. The vanishing hour, the 13-minute blackout, the footage. Every time he sat down in front of his laptop, he felt the weight of it pressing down on him. Something just beyond the edge of understanding. Something wrong. The scratches on his arms had started to appear more frequently. Thin red lines, burning, raw, but never deep enough to bleed. They were always there when he woke up, thin reminders of what he didn't remember happening. His dreams had become stranger too. In them, he'd find himself back in Sarah and Ben's bedroom, watching the clock flicker from 2:46 to 2:47. That final second hanging like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. The footsteps in the hallway would come closer and closer, heavier, as though something large was dragging itself towards him. But it wasn't just dreams. The waking hours were worse. The clock in his own apartment had started ticking louder, the rhythmic sound getting under his skin. The blackouts came, not just at night, but during the day. He'd lose track of time, find himself staring at the walls, his mind blank. Then there was his phone. He'd check it in the morning and find missed calls to numbers he didn't recognize, voicemails filled with static and the faint sound of breathing. Every now and then, he'd hear a voice, his name, whispered as though it came out of somewhere deep within the receiver. It was getting to him, and it was starting to get dangerous. David knew he needed answers. His initial research into the vanishing hour had opened the door, but he'd barely stepped through it. It was time to dive deeper. He found himself late one night on a forum for the paranormal. It wasn't the kind of place he'd normally be caught dead browsing. Filled with amateur ghost hunters, conspiracy theorists, and people who'd claim their houses were haunted by grandma because their door creaked funny. But David had run out of options. The police department had no use for the dead ends he was chasing, and he wasn't about to tell his colleagues that he thought a cursed hour had driven Sarah and Ben to murder-suicide. He created an anonymous account, using a pseudonym to mask his identity, and typed the words that made his skin crawl. Has anyone ever heard of the vanishing hour? At first, the responses were nothing special. Typical internet trash. People laughing it off, calling it a hoax, or linking to YouTube videos of supposed ghost encounters. But then, as he scrolled further, something stopped him cold. "You need to stop," one response said. "Now, it's too late for them, but not for you. The vanishing hour marks you. If you've seen the signs, it's already started. You won't remember what happens at 2:47 a.m., but the scars will show. Leave before it takes you too." The username was Watcher in the Dark. No profile picture, no past posts. The message was short, but it sent a jolt of adrenaline through David's body. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. What happens at 2:47? He waited for a reply, his heart racing, the clock in his apartment ticking the seconds away. But no answer came. The forum remained silent. David closed the laptop, his eyes darting around the darkened apartment. He felt like he was being watched, like something was there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. He shook his head, trying to brush it off, but the feeling lingered. It was the same sensation he'd had when he'd stepped into Sarah and Ben's house for the first time. Something was watching him. The deeper David dug, the more unsettling the connections became. He began searching for old police reports, poring over local archives, chasing down every lead. There were stories scattered across the region, going back decades. People who'd woken up at 2:47 a.m. with no memory of what had happened. Others who had committed violent acts, unaware of what they'd done. One case stood out. A man from a small town just a few miles from where Sarah and Ben had lived. He'd been found dead in his home, a gunshot wound to the head. The coroner had ruled it a suicide, but the investigation had been sloppy. The man's family had reported strange behavior leading up to his death. He'd started waking up at night, confused and disoriented, scratching at his own skin, leaving deep welts across his arms and chest. His wife had found him staring out the window on more than one occasion, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. The clock in their house had been stopped at 2:47 a.m. David felt his pulse quicken as he read the report. The details were too close, too similar. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. A curse spreading from house to house, town to town, leaving death in its wake. He found another case, this one from the 1980s. An elderly woman had gone missing, her body never found. The last person to see her had been her granddaughter, who'd reported that the woman had become obsessed with the clock in her home, convinced it was stopping at 2:47 a.m. every night. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, her sheets tangled, her fingernails bloody from scratching at her own skin. The granddaughter had heard her grandmother whispering to herself in the dark, as though she was talking to someone who wasn't there. Then, one night, the woman had simply vanished. The granddaughter had found her bedroom empty, the clock still ticking away. But when she looked closer, she saw that it was broken, frozen at 2:47 a.m., just like all the others. As the days went on, David's own experience with the blackouts became worse. He started waking up in different rooms, once standing in the kitchen, staring at the sink with the water running. Another time he was at the front door, hand on the knob, as if ready to leave. But the worst was when he woke up with his phone clutched in his hand. He had no memory of dialing anyone, but the call log showed a number he didn't recognize. The voicemail was just a few seconds long. Silence. Then a voice. A rasping breath. It whispered his name. David felt the walls closing in. He knew he was running out of time, that whatever had taken Sarah and Ben was coming for him too. The evidence was all there. He just couldn't make it stop. Every night, the clock in his apartment ticked louder, the sound drilling into his skull like a countdown to something inevitable. The night David confronted his darkest fears felt endless, as though time itself had twisted to prolong his dread. Each minute leading up to 2:47 a.m. dragged on, heavy and oppressive. Every second a lead weight pressing down on his chest. He sat hunched at his kitchen table, determined to stay awake until 2:47, convinced that this was the hour to solve the puzzle that had haunted him. The glow of his laptop cast eerie shadows across his face. His hands shook uncontrollably. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, like the very air around him had thickened. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:30 a.m. The ticking was slow and deliberate, a metronome counting down to something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. 17 minutes. His pulse quickened. The apartment felt too still, the air too thick, as if something invisible had seeped into the walls, watching, waiting. The ticking of the clock echoed louder, pounding in his ears, as if mocking him. He tried to focus on the laptop screen, scrolling through the forum where he'd posted his desperate questions. But the words were a blur, meaningless. His mind was unraveling, frayed at the edges. Each tick of the clock another thread being pulled loose. He rubbed his temples, feeling the tension thrumming under his skin. Every shadow in the apartment seemed to stretch and bend, warping reality. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the reflection in the darkened window. For a split second, he swore he saw something, flash of movement. But when he turned his head, there was nothing. Just the empty street below, bathed in the cold glow of the streetlights. 16 minutes. David stood up, his legs unsteady, and paced the room, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, a relentless countdown. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes darting around the apartment, searching for something, anything that made sense. But nothing did. He hadn't slept in days, not properly. His body was shutting down, and his mind was breaking. He heard it again, the whisper. A low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't coming from the laptop this time. It was closer, more intimate, like it was crawling through the walls, wrapping around him. David's mouth went dry. He spun around, staring at the corners of the room, his eyes wide and frantic. But there was nothing. Just shadows. 14 minutes. David's skin prickled, his body screaming at him to leave, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted in place, paralyzed by the weight of the air, the thick, suffocating presence that pressed down on him from all sides. The clock ticked louder, each second a hammering blow to his skull. And then he felt it. Cold breath against the back of his neck. Icy fingers tracing down his spine, leaving a trail of goosebumps in their wake. His heart clenched. He wanted to scream, to claw at his skin, to tear himself away from whatever was behind him. But he couldn't move. His entire body had gone rigid, locked in place as the feeling grew stronger, more insistent. 12 minutes. David stumbled back to the kitchen table, collapsing into the chair, his eyes darting between the laptop and the clock on the wall. The clock hands flickered, wavering between 2:46 and 2:47, as though time itself was struggling to hold together. The laptop screen flashed, the grainy footage playing on its own. David's stomach turned as Sarah and Ben's gaunt faces filled the screen. The static hummed louder now, grating in his ears, twisting his thoughts into knots. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to shut out the images, but they burned into his mind. His name, whispered again, so close it sent a jolt through his body. 10 minutes. His eyes snapped open, and his breath came in harsh, ragged gasps. The apartment was suffocating, the air too thick to breathe. Sweat dripped down from his forehead, mixing with the tears that he didn't remember shedding. His hands trembled violently as he searched for the phone on the table, but it was gone. He glanced around the room, panicked, feeling the walls closing in on him. He wasn't alone. He could feel something standing right beside him. 8 minutes. David's vision blurred, his body growing cold, his limbs heavy. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. He was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the laptop screen, where the footage played on a loop. The air was still now, unnaturally so, as if the entire world had stopped. David's mind was splintering, fraying with each passing second. He couldn't remember when the blackouts had started. At first, it was just the sleepless nights, the vague sense of something watching him. Then it was the scratches on his skin, the cold that seeped into his bones. But now it was different. His body felt like it wasn't his own, like something had slipped inside of him, worming its way into his thoughts, his soul. 6 minutes. David blinked, trying to focus, but the world around him was fading, slipping through his fingers like sand. His thoughts were jumbled, incoherent. He couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. The whispers were louder now, hissing in his ears. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't understand them. His body jerked involuntarily, his fingers twitching as though someone else was controlling them. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every part of him screamed to wake up, to break free. But the darkness was too thick, too heavy. 4 minutes. He stood, slowly, his legs moving of their own accord. The weight of the gun in his hand was heavy, foreign, like it didn't belong to him. His mind screamed at him to stop, to drop it. But his body moved without him, as though he was a puppet on strings. David staggered towards the kitchen table, his eyes glassy, his movements jerky. He sat down, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his ears. The whispers were louder now, deafening, filling his mind with their incessant noise. 2 minutes. The clock on the wall blinked. 2:46, then 2:47. The static from the TV flickered in the background, casting strange shadows across the room. David's hand moved slowly, almost mechanically, lifting the gun to his temple. His body trembled violently, every muscle screaming in protest. But his mind was gone, lost in the suffocating dark. The last thing David saw was the clock flickering between 2:46 and 2:47. And then, everything went still. The next morning, when Detective David Cole didn't show up for his shift, 2 officers were sent to check on him. The apartment was cold, unnaturally so. Officer Matthew Thompson, the rookie who found him, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air in the apartment was thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding a terrible secret. David's body was slumped over the kitchen table, the gun still in his hand, a single gunshot wound to his temple. His eyes were open, wide, as though he'd seen something in those final moments, something that had shattered his mind. The clock on the wall blinked, frozen at 2:47 a.m. In his report, Thompson noted one final detail. Just as he was about to leave, he glanced back at the kitchen. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the grainy image of a man flicker on David's laptop screen. The figure was indistinct, shifting in the static, but it felt disturbingly familiar, enough to make Thompson's heart skip a beat. He blinked, his eyes fixed on the screen, but it was gone. The screen had gone dark, as if the image had never been there at all. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the TV, flickering with static in the corner. The coroner would later rule it a suicide, clean and simple. But Officer Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something they hadn't seen. As he stepped out of the apartment, he glanced at his watch, feeling the chill crawl up his spine. 2:47 a.m.